So, Tristan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Finn, for having me. Excited to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Could you just put us all on the same page and tell us a bit about your background and what you do today?
Yeah, so I think you've reached out, because I've recently written a book called Bitcoin and Beef, which discusses, why decentralization is important, the connection between our food and monetary systems. And the reason why I wrote that is the last 4 or 5 years, I've kind of been really passionate about both health and the food system. And then on the flip side of the coin, kind of the monetary system. So it's kind of two passions that I've been going back and forth with. And since COVID, a lot of shifts have happened at a societal level, both from government intervention, and then also people starting to question kind of what's going on at the high level. And I feel like I've connected with a lot of like-minded individuals and really wanted to just write about something that could kind of connect everything together on why some people are really interested in these topics and why they're imperative on the individual level.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I've certainly seen and heard, and myself included, people who have gone through the pandemic, and that's just like lifted a curtain and like lifted this whole like Pandora's box of like, hang on, who's really got control over our lives here, and what really matters when someone pulls up the drawbridge on food systems or like global trade. So, can you tell us about like what maybe the state is of the financial system and the food system at the moment, and why decentralization is important?
Yeah. So yeah, just diving in, from the financial monetary system side of things, right? Like the US dollar has kind of been the global reserve currency since World War II, and all global trade is denominated in the US dollar. And really, since, the Federal Reserve was created in the early 20th century, it's been kind of this giant, Ponzi scheme going on in our monetary system where we were kind of partly backed by gold. And then in 1971, when President Nixon here in the U.S. Took us, like, severed the last tie with any gold backing of our monetary system, we went what you would call fully fiat, which is basically means that the fiat currency, the U.S. dollar, is really backed by nothing because it's not tied to any direct amount of gold. Whereas before, you'd be able to, bring in your paper receipt. Like that's what paper currency was supposed to always be, is you bring in your paper receipt to the bank and they would give you X amount of gold. And why did that happen and why has that happened? It's because they've expanded the money supply to such a degree that they can't back that with any amount of gold. It doesn't mean that the US or any of European countries, big economic powers, have no gold. They have quite a bit in their reserves, but the amount of paper fiat currency in circulation has superseded that to such a degree. And since then we've just seen massive amounts of inflation and the dropping off a cliff of your purchasing power for the US dollar, for the the euro since its inception, for the pound in the UK. And this is kind of a trend that has not been fairly dispersed across society, right? Like college tuition and the price of a home have gone up 1,000%, while the amount of money or income or average salary has only gone up like a few 100%. So it's not correlated to the degree that you can survive and still thrive and save enough money by just saving money. You have to do other things and go out of your way as an individual to really make it out of the quote unquote rat race, because the average S&P 500 or standard stock index is really only going up just enough or maybe slightly above what inflation is. And even the whole problem with inflation is the way they calculate it is in such a misleading way. They changed the way they calculated it from the 70s to now. And even now in 2023, they already announced that they're going to use a new method of calculation. So in reality, that means that it's quite high. It's much higher than it really is announced by the Federal Reserve in every country.
So how were they calculating inflation then versus now?
It's just a different mix of like basket of goods in terms of what is going. It's because it's hard to really pinpoint, and obviously it'll be different for each person. But they take like a basket of goods, like, how much does, a gallon of milk or a gallon of gasoline cost compared to like the prior year. And that mix has just been altered, and they might weight it differently. And really, what matters most, food, gasoline and housing, like housing costs are not really reflected in the CPI. And obviously those are far more imperative than like, material goods, which are often, a stronghold in the current calculation. So it's all just, I mean, you'd have to go and read it yourself, but it's yeah, you could probably X out half the shit and be like, I don't even care about this.
And like I want to dig deeper into like the decentralization aspect in a minute, and about, Bitcoin and where that fits in, and cryptocurrencies, and, maybe removing power from the state. But in terms of like people who would argue that, well, prices have gone up on homes because we have more people, it's a supply and demand issue.
Yeah, I mean, well, then it would go up. The reason why homes have gone up far more than, income, for example, is because people are using them not just as a means of housing. They're being used as a means of, a safe haven investment. Because what happens when you lose faith in, the currency, and you're kind of pricing in future amounts of inflation, you want assets that are, hard and physical. So like for the longest time, that was gold, that was metals, and it was, land, tangible things, houses. They're going to retain their value and appreciate over time, while, the dollar or the euro or the pound or what fiat currency have you will depreciate. So that is why many investment firms like buy up so many homes. I mean, you have just millionaires, billionaires with like, thousands of units of real estate. So it is a supply and demand thing to some degree, because, there's certain areas where people are moving to, and, there's more people. And, there was a supply demand issue in the housing market, because also the amount of inflation in the raw material costs, like lumber, went up such a significant amount. And then that affected, builders being able to acquire that. And, there was some supply chain issue, but in the higher level, if you take a step back, those are smaller ebbs and flows, to where the real issue is just there's people with, millions of dollars that have 10 homes that are using it from an investment perspective. And then that just inflates the price, past where, the average individual can afford it, because their salary has not gone up over the past 20 years to the degree that the housing market has.
So if we follow this through, like, so we've got the Federal Reserve who's controlling the money printing, and that's like in the Europe and the UK, we've got the Bank of England, and we've got like the European Reserve Bank. I don't know the name.
Yeah, the European Central Bank. Yeah.
European Central Bank. So this is basically the definition of a very centralized financial system, right? So we have these three main areas, and I guess we've got other ones in Asia, and we've got the Bank of China, and we've got like these other big countrywide banks who are controlling the money supply within their own countries. So that's very centralized. Why is that not good? Apart from the inflation aspect, like, why is that an issue?
Yeah, it's just an issue because of, how, they have, taken action on, fixing the economy or having the economy run. And really, the Federal Reserve is so interesting, and I highly recommend anyone who wants to take a deeper dive read The Creature of Jekyll Island. Is a very in-depth book, and it goes through the whole entire history, and the inception of it is very controversial. And, it goes into the likes of, JP Morgan and these billionaire of the time commercial bankers that really schemed with some senators to get the Federal Reserve created. And what's so unique about the Federal Reserve in the US is that it's not really like part of the government. It's like a total separate entity. So it has this like untangible amount of power and influence to make these decisions. And obviously the monetary system is, what runs a country.
But that was that was deliberate, wasn't it? To keep it like separate from government, because they didn't want government going crazy with spending.
Exactly. And also, so they kind of had their own, the commercial bankers had all this influence then on the Federal Reserve, and they called it the Federal Reserve because it's just a fancy name for a central bank, and they didn't want it to be called a federal central bank. They wanted to act like it was part of the government, when in reality it was just a super large, centralized system. And why that has been an issue is because they've used that to their advantage to just flood the market with more money and fixing interest rates. I mean, there's a lot of collusion going on the inside. But today, yeah, I mean, if you're in the top 1 to 5%, top 0.1% of the super wealthy, you kind of get money. You understand how the system works, and you understand that inflation is happening. But you can get into a lot of good debt by borrowing money from these guys, because we have a fractional reserve banking system where every bank in the US is allowed to lend out $10 for every $1 they hold, which if you explain to a random stranger on the street, they would be like, that's a giant Ponzi scheme. But that's what legally, the government does. So the rich folks understand how this works. They get in good debt, and then they invest in assets that will appreciate at the rate that's higher than inflation. But then they have no real income, because their income is all in assets, and all their money, they're in debt, but they're making money on their debt. So they pay no taxes. Exactly. And then the average, societal member, the bottom 99%, is just working a salary, where if it's a decent amount of money, say you're an engineer, a lawyer, a doctor, you're paying 30 to 50% in taxes. And then you're not making enough money because you're saving. You think saving is the right thing to do. But your dollar or your pound is depreciating. And then you have to play part-time investor. Well, you're not an investor. You're a doctor, a lawyer, and you're really not going to make enough gains to ever escape out of that. Unless you become like a small business owner and really have some, there's a lot of success stories still in the US. I mean, this is a place for entrepreneurial spirit. And there are a lot of tax breaks for businesses. But still, I saw a stat yesterday, 0.8% of Americans have an LLC. So only a very few amount are taking that risk, when in reality, it's not that big of a risk. You just need to try stuff. So it's really just set up for the wealthy folks who understand money to take advantage of the system.
Well, there's also the obvious elephant in the room of education, whereby none of this is taught in schools.
Exactly. So the most important things, health, nutrition, money, debt, how these things work are really not a foundation of education. Yeah, and it's quite sad, because these are the most important things, and that's why I wrote about it. So that's and then you can look, why is this also an issue? You look at just the commercial banking space and how many fines and violations. I think I have in the books, the top commercial banks have paid over $200 billion in fines since the turn of the century in 2000, just by breaking laws, fraudulent things, or laundering money. And yeah, they're really just getting a slap on the wrist for something that you and I would go to jail for. And this is happening all across big banking, big money, big food, big pharma, big ag. They're all kind of swindling the average individual and just getting a slap on the wrist for when they do get caught.
Yeah, it's just factored into the cost of doing business for them, isn't it? It's like, well, if we manage to swindle people out of $1 billion, and if we get noticed, we'll get 100 million fine. That's still 900 million profit. So it's an obvious no-brainer.
Yeah, exactly. And all of this comes back and ties to today in 2023, we have just over the past 100 years, we've traded so much of the quality of life for convenience. And that's where these big corporations have really taken advantage. Why does everyone feels like you have to have a bank account and it's secure in there, and that's why you let these banks loan out your money 10 times over. But if you had $50,000 you wanted to go take out tomorrow, they wouldn't even let you. You would need to have very advanced notice, or if you wanted to just take the full amount of your money out, they would not let you do that. And why? Just so you are physically trusting this corporation, and you don't have to worry about your money because they're handling it. But in reality, they're just ripping you off.
I think it's one of those things that we were in a sweet spot before, I guess maybe just pre 1917 or so, when it was gold backed, and you could go to a bank with your slip of paper and you could get gold, and so it allowed the free movement of capital across borders much easier. It allowed things like trade to flow much easier. But now sort of swung too far on the pendulum, whereby all of the power is in the banking system, and they know all the rules and they're really exploiting them. So,
and this is not the first time. Like, this has happened so many times, like across history, right? Like, the average life of a global reserve currency is roughly like 90 to 100 years because of this, because the government or whoever's in charge of the money they either lend out too much money or they print too much money to expand it, to try and do more economically, and then it always comes back and collapses in their face. And it started, why the pound was the global reserve currency until World War II, because they got involved in a war, and we all got involved in a war they shouldn't have, in World War I, and nobody wanted to pay for it, and they raised public bonds, and I think like 1/3 got funded by the public. So then the other 2/3, basically, they just had to print money, and that fully disconnected the pound to gold backing and metal backing. And then from there, it's just a downward spiral. It just matters, matter of time on how long that happens. And that's happened with, the Netherlands, Portugal. I mean, Roman Empire used to cut their money with, inferior metals and not tell the public. That was how they printed money, 1,000 years ago. So
it's all
all
just
been
absolutely
done.
standard.
Yeah, it's very standard, and this boom and bust cycles, and then someone will rise up. But what's different now is, before it was always gold was kind of the standard of backing, but now we have a decentralized, scarce asset that's fully native and digital to the internet, the age we live in, which is Bitcoin. So it offers, that in terms of scarcity and a deflationary circulating supply that's baked into its core code. So it's really fascinating. It's really cool to see this available now.
So I'm glad you brought that up. So can you just tell us top line, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, what Bitcoin is? And for the person who's heard about it a few times, but they just still can't get their head around it, how would you describe it?
Yeah, and that's the problem, is most people have heard about it. They might even own it, but they really don't understand why it's fundamentally so important. And that's because it was created coming out of the 08-09 financial crisis, where there was so many over leveraged banks, and some of them actually went bankrupt. Well, some got unlucky enough to not get bailed out by the government. The big boys, a lot of the big boys just got bailed out. But what Bitcoin is, it's a peer-to-peer electronic cash. So there's no third-party financial institution that's required to use it to send money from one party to another. So that's what's different about Bitcoin from, a transaction perspective. Is it's not like PayPal, where you still, if I want to send money to you, Finn, it still has to go through my bank, get approved, go to your bank, get approved, and then that money settles wherever, and then it appears in your account. This is totally peer-to-peer. So there's no third-party financial institution. But how does that work? You need someone to verify that A, I have the funds, then B, your address is correct, and then you receive the funds. So that's where the Bitcoin network comes into play. So the network that's full of nodes and miners, and that's constantly verifying these transactions. They are verifying that in order to get they're incentivized to do it, to get rewarded with Bitcoin. And that's how new Bitcoin is released into circulation, through these nodes and miners. So they're verifying the transactions that are fully peer-to-peer. And then they're also simultaneously releasing new Bitcoin into circulation. So that's how it's fundamentally different on, a transaction perspective. But from a scarcity perspective, there's 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be created. This is a fixed number, can never be changed. It's in the core code of the network. Currently, there's over 19 million that have already been mined or released into circulation. But the next 2 million or 1 point something million will be released over the course of like the next 80 to 100 years. So it's kind of a deflationary exponential curve in terms of the supply. And that's really programmed scarcity. So, in a time where the dollar, the pound, the euro, everything in terms of fiat currencies are just increasing like crazy. I think 40 to 50% of all US dollars have been created in the last 3 years. Something that has a fixed supply and a deflationary addition to the supply is very attractive. And then lastly, it's purely digital. So if I wanted to send, across the world, say I had $10 million, you could send it like that. In 10 minutes, it'll be confirmed on the network, and you can divide it, and it's very divisible into any amount down to the 1/1,000,000th of a Bitcoin. If you just wanted to send $5 across the world, you could, and you'll pay very low transaction fees for that. So that's where gold kind of falls apart, because moving immense amount of money in gold is very, physically demanding, and storing gold, because it's, heavy and a metal, that's the downsides of it.
On there expensive costs associated with transferring Bitcoin, depending on network usage?
It can have network, fees that are higher, but typically, and there's a lot of on-ramp fees to, if you buy it off Coinbase or some other exchange, there can be quite a large amount of fees involved in that. But in reality, transacting directly peer-to-peer is quite cheap. And if you do it for smaller amounts, to where you can use the Lightning Network, which we could get into, is a very low amount of fees. So it's definitely a scalability thing, but still, the amount of fees you'd pay going through like a traditional banking system, it's not very high at all compared to that. And we're still very early in the adoption of Bitcoin as well.
Because there's one thing that springs to my mind, and it's the fact that, aren't we just creating, although we can't create any more Bitcoin after 21 million, aren't we just creating the same situation where instead of someone having all the gold, like the pharaohs, the emperors, the states, the banks, aren't we just then creating the same, but in a digital currency, because someone's just going to have all the Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big complaint has been that, it's not very evenly spread out. It's, very heavily owned by a lot of exchanges, or, I mean, who knows, underground billionaires that just got in really early. And that may be the case, but as kind of time goes on, that supply, or that, spread will definitely filter out. I mean, we've already seen like a lot of these over leveraged exchanges kind of go bankrupt and go under. So yeah, again, we're still super early into this. I don't think it's as centralized in terms of the large holders as people make it out to seem. There's definitely a lot of players who own a lot of Bitcoin, but over time, I think that'll naturally kind of even out to a greater degree than we see currently. Yeah, with gold. I mean, gold is owned by just like large nation states, and I mean, the wealth distribution of just like dollars and billionaires is so substantial. So, but then again, people will be rewarded for certainly holding Bitcoin very early, and they should be, because guess what? I mean, since its inception, it's gone up, an absurd amount, hundreds to thousands percent, and then it would drop like 70 to 90%. That's happened 3 times now. So if you held through 90% drawdown, yeah, maybe you should be rewarded, in 10, 20 years for holding on. But a lot of people have not, and they have, a lot of Bitcoin is still changing hands.
But that's the other, like, because there's main arguments against this stuff. It doesn't have utility, and we'll get onto that. And you've kind of explained why it does have utility. And other people saying that it's so volatile that, how can you possibly have a currency that one day it's worth, let's put it into dollar format, one day it's worth $1,000, the next day it's worth $2. It's like, how do you run a financial system on something that's so volatile?
Yeah, and it seems so volatile as well, because it's priced in the US dollar. And, the dollar, if you put the supply and purchasing power, I mean, it looks almost just as volatile in Bitcoin, just in the opposite direction. So if you start pricing things just in Bitcoin, I mean, why has it up 30% in the last week? Is because it looks like the Fed is going to pause interest rate hikes or slow them down, which they are, and pause them eventually. So it's really it's volatile because for a while it was so nascent, and people are starting to see that value. And it's volatile the past year, 2 years, because the monetary system has injected all this money, and that's why you see this meteoric rise, and people are going to safe haven investments. But then they became very hawkish and increased interest rates. But again, the market cap is still in a ballpark to where it can be pretty volatile, and we've seen that come down each cycle. And I would expect that to just kind of become less volatile over time. But again, it's at the whims of the Federal Reserve and the monetary system across the board. And I mean, go ask someone in Argentina or Zimbabwe if Bitcoin's volatile. They have 50-80+% inflation year on year, and Bitcoin's a saving grace for them. Venezuela, I mean, they can't even and just Weimar Republic. There's so many cases where like
Salvador.
inflation, has gotten so bad that immediately when someone gets paid, they sprint to the grocery store to buy food. And if Bitcoin is like down or up 10-20% on a day, sure, that can happen, but it's nothing like these other currencies when they really get in some inflationary trouble.
For sure. I mean, I mentioned El Salvador there because they've adopted as a reserve currency themselves. So anyone who hasn't heard about that, and that was hugely I think it was, I don't know the word, but hugely frowned upon by people in the US and these big banking states saying, all it's going to do is increase crime and all these other arguments.
Yeah, but we'll see, and obviously it's been down a bit since, El Salvador decided to do that, but let's check in on them in 4 years and we'll see, because people are, and that's what all this is all about, right? And why I align with Bitcoin so well is because it's having a low time preference mindset. It's starting to think in multi-year, timeframes instead of just by the day, by the week. Our modern society is so hung up in what's the latest news headline, and TikToks, Instagram reels, like 30 seconds. Our attention spans are dwindling by the day, and people just want to get rich quick, and that's why so many people have gotten burned by crypto. But I'm here to say, crypto and Bitcoin are completely different things. Every other cryptocurrency has a CEO, has a marketing team, and really they're just looking to make a lot of money. Some of them are, they are actually trying to solve problems, but again, you're investing in a very centralized company and coin, whereas Bitcoin has no CEO, no team, no founders, completely anonymous. So no one can change the core principles of the supply and how the network functions. There can be some things added on, and there's a lot of developers working on it, such as the Lightning Network. But yeah, it's really fundamentally different from any money we've ever seen because of that.
And I want to touch on the other avenue of your book, Bitcoin and Beef. So where does beef fit into all this?
Yeah, so the title is called Bitcoin and Beef. Really, it's about regenerative agriculture and fixing the food system. And often beef is like made a main scapegoat, and has a huge negative connotation in the mainstream media nowadays. But it's actually one of the largest keys to regenerating our environment, our soil, sequestering carbon. You can go down the list. I mean, technically, it doesn't have to be beef. It could be any ruminant animal, but beef just happens to be, probably the most popular in terms of ruminants in the modern world, first world countries for sure, at least. So yeah, that's what it's all about. It's talking about how, beef has been demonized in the mainstream media and red meat from a nutrition perspective. I talk about how as a society, we're unhealthier, although lifespan has been increasing over the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's a poor indicator of societal health. We have chronic disease through the roof. And at the turn of the 20th century, most people are dying of infectious diseases. And there's, big red meat propaganda, vegan, vegetarian diets have become so popular. Processed food consumption is through the roof, seed oils, processed sugars, you can go down the list. And I talk about that. And that's important, but really what comes down to is, how did we come to this, and how is our food system set up? and it's, very subsidized monocrop agriculture, growing mostly corn, soy, and wheat. And then subsidizing the farmers who do that. So it's controlling market prices, keeping them artificially low, giving farmers a guaranteed paycheck so they don't really want to switch to doing anything else. And monocrop agriculture has destroyed the health of our soil, which has destroyed the nutrient quality of our foods. And it's also destroyed the soil's ability to function as a natural ecosystem. So it releases a ton of carbon by doing so. It destroys the biodiversity and resilience of the land. So its ability to like hold water, stave off drought, stave off pests, for example, and then thus requires far more chemical inputs. And that's where, glyphosate, atrazine, a lot of these herbicides, fungicides come into play. Now this is all in our food, genetically modifying that so they can withstand these harsh chemicals. And you could, take this back all to the monetary system as well, because it's just this insatiable need to grow and grow and grow. It started from, a population boom perspective. I think post World War II, this was a huge concern that we were never going to be able to feed the world.
Green revolution.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where this all kind of gained a ton of momentum. And we, in America, we did what we did best, and we put on our, industrial factory mindset and put it into the food system. So it's high input, it's high output, like I'm saying. So grow one crop for thousands and thousands of acres and use chemicals and fertilizers to get that yield as high as possible. And did that work? Yeah, it worked. We created a ton of food, and now we have more than enough food, and populations really, especially in first world countries, is not exactly the issue. And we also waste so much food. But in turn, we have degraded the quality of our, of our food system from a nutrient perspective, and we've degraded our land and our soil. So we're actually seeing stagnating yields now, and we're seeing just the inability for crops and farmers to get through, changing climates, pests, and retain the amount of water they need. So we're wasting so much water for farming and agriculture, when we really should be looking below the ground in terms of how do we fix all of this. And that's what regenerative agriculture is all about. It's about looking to nature and using holistic methods to manage land. And what does nature have? It has biodiversity, which is just vast amounts of life from below the ground, above the ground, variety of plant species, and then a variety of animals as well. And that's what it's all about. And how do you do that? And why did we get there? We got there because of, highly centralized systems. So the Green Revolution, started, and a lot of big companies, invested a lot of money into growing their farming methods and farming businesses. And then into the 70s, 1971, important date for both money and food. It's when we went off the gold standard. Nixon took us off the gold standard, but also Nixon appointed Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, whose whole motto was "Go big or go home." He basically encouraged all these farmers to take out a bunch of debt and expand their operations, go monocrop agriculture. And then with the inflating interest rates across the decade, so many of them went bankrupt, huge consolidation. And now you see just almost the most amount of centralization in this industry compared to any other. There's 4 meat packers that control 80% of the meat industry globally. And it's turned into multinational billion-dollar corporations running the show. And this is where we're at today. And it's a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had heard from someone, I wanted to draw this, the highlight that most farmers, 99% of farmers, do not wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to degrade the soil today, or I want to degrade the soil today. Most farmers have a love and a passion for the land. But just as you're saying, many have been bound by either these subsidies premise, or by they can't get insurance on their crop unless they grow the crops that are being sanctioned by the insurance company. And because they have to put the same chemical fertilizer and they have to put the same chemical-based pesticides on, so they can't guarantee yields unless they're using these products. So there's a whole web around there. And I always want to pull the attention away from demonizing the farmer, because that's how we've got to this issue with saying things like climate change and its issues with the farmers and beef and all this stuff, when really it's, as you said, it's this centralization, this insidious centralization of these farming systems. And I'd actually heard this anecdote. There was a school somewhere in the US, and there's a local farmer down the road, and he was selling all this lovely, great produce, like regeneratively made or organically grown or really great standard produce, but he wasn't allowed to sell it to the school because the school had to have a contract with a central buying agency who was a central fruit and vegetable distributor, which was selling the cost of the goods at sort of double or triple the price. So the school is paying more for the food for worse quality and less diversity, and the farmer is desperately scrabbling to try and sell his produce somewhere in bulk.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a perfect example of just like what is wrong with the current system from all fronts, education. Like there's so much bureaucracy going on. And yeah, it's not really the fault of the farmer. It's they don't know any better. And then B, the average age of a farmer is like late 50s, early 60s. So they're not just going to make some inspirational jump because it is a high risk, right? Like if a hailstorm wipes out their whole crop field, they're still getting a check from the government if they're growing soybeans or wheat or corn. If they make this jump to regenerative agriculture, it's a risk, and you might not see that pay off for 2 or 3 years. Is kind of like a normal time frame. It could be shorter, it could be longer. And yeah, if you're 60 years old and you don't want to just do all that, then you're just going to keep doing what you know. And the problem is, now nobody wants to be in farming because there's no money to be made into it. And the next generation is really doing other jobs. And I think my friend talked about it on Twitter this past week, is like 400 million acres of farmland by 2030 is going to change hands, which is scary because there's all these big corporations just sitting waiting to capitalize on this even more so. But it's also an opportunity for people who do want to get involved, younger folks like around our age, that if they, there's a lot of farmers out there who are willing to take on younger help. And then potentially, I mean, you could be in line for taking over an operation without even being part of the family, or at least, influencing how they think about farming. And yeah, it's really just a problem and a byproduct of how the system has been run for so long. But fortunately, regenerative agriculture is starting to gain some momentum. So I'm optimistic to some degree, for sure.
And where does this fit in with, we don't think centralized, or I certainly think, and I know you don't think, centralized power of food system is good just on a power and sort of human freedom aspect. But where does this leave in terms of human health? Are we not just going to have more localized eating of the same stuff, but we're going to have the same health issues? Why does that impact health?
Yeah, it impacts health because like the whole system has been set up. At first it was just to get enough calories, to feed the world. That's all people cared about was calories. And like I said, these main 3 crops that we're growing, soybeans, corn, and wheat, they're going into ultra processed foods. And this food system is set up to where these multi-billion-dollar corporations on the food side of thing, like the Nestle's of the world, the PepsiCo's, they are taking these super cheap ingredients and making processed foods, and they can make a lot more profit and money off of this. Local farmers who are doing it the right way, they're not going to grow that kind of, those kinds of crops. They're going to grow, vegetables, fruits. They're going to raise animals and livestock, eggs, beef, pork, chicken. And yeah, that's all far more nutrient dense than Pop-Tarts that are filled with, hydrogenated vegetable oils and just corn syrup and wheat that's been sprayed with all sorts of chemicals. So from a health perspective, it's really tipped the scale in making processed foods ridiculously cheap. So that's why a lot of people buy them. And also these big food companies have worked their, flavor sensing magic to make these foods, highly addictive. And we know, just oodles of processed sugar is highly addictive as well. So that's, where we're at. And it's a problem, because if someone's just trying to feed their family and they really don't know any better, or they don't even know how to cook, which is so common in today's modern society, they're just going to get this processed garbage, and they're really just paying for empty calories and getting no nutrition. So if we go back to a more decentralized way of getting our food to the table, you're incentivized to buy local, and you want to buy from a local farmer who's doing it right. And then you can verify, the quality of his or her operation by going there in person. And then you can, pay them money that will stay in your local economy, as opposed to going to these multinational billion-dollar corporations.
But don't most people live in cities? And like, how do you have like a proper localized food system in like Las Vegas or like New York when you've got loads of suburbs and stuff? You're still going to have to truck in loads of like food and like,
for sure, that's where it becomes tricky, is when you get into the multi-million-dollar or multi-million population centers like New York City, Los Angeles. I mean, Vegas is in the middle of a desert. Probably shouldn't that never would have been a city like 500 years ago, because it makes no sense from a resource utilization perspective to have that there. But modern technology, and now they have no water, and except the water for the golf courses. But
I guess that's part of the problem, isn't it? Like,
exactly,
we've built unnatural things on top of an unnatural food system. So like any change destabilizes the whole thing.
Exactly. And this is like what Joe Rogan, if you've seen his episode with Will Harris, who's from White Oak Pastures, who's a regenerative rancher, it's all he's asking about. And I think Joe is quite clever and he understands, but these are the questions that everybody's asking. It's like, how are we going to feed LA, or can we scale regenerative agriculture? And yeah, it's a challenge from just like a numbers perspective, but the whole reason why it could work and it has to work is from a decentralized, manners, to where, like, say I'm in Utah, here we have Salt Lake City. It's a pretty big, population center. Is there enough, food in Utah within 100 miles to feed this population center? And we stay within a local economy, and it's like our priority to do this. And I would say, yeah, there should be. I mean, California grows so much food. I mean, they're shipping it all over the country. So if they can get to a more decentralized format, or if everybody who had just like a tiny strip of grass in their yard, or a quarter acre or less, had chickens, I mean, we wouldn't even have an egg industry. We wouldn't have this whole egg shortage crisis going on right now. And then you take that 30 to 40% of food wasted, and you feed it, upcycle half of that with chickens. Or, I mean, people used to always have like a hog in their backyards, whether it was in the UK or in the US back in the day, because that's how they fed their family. That's decentralized food, and that's how you scale it. You need to get more creative in that manner, but you can't put a number or calculation to this. It's like, it has to happen at the individual, the localized level, and then you can go from there. But still,
that's
LA,
the whole
New
thing.
York,
it's like the romanticized view of regenerative agriculture, of like, the farmer, the sort of local scale farmer, he's like he's got 50 cattle, and they go across the land and they stomp down the land and they get it ready for growth of other crops and everything. And that is great at the localized level, but we're talking about scales and numbers like that the human mind can't even comprehend. Like, I'd heard that we need to grow the same amount of food that we've grown in the last 500 years between now and 2060.
Yeah, potentially, from
in a calorie volume,
I guess. Yeah. And that's, I haven't seen those numbers, but yeah, I mean, the population is still growing. But it's mostly growing in areas like third world countries like Nigeria, these parts of Africa that are kind of just industrializing now, are growing far faster. I mean, Germany, Japan, like they have like negative birth rates. So really, I mean, Europe doesn't have any more room for people. So but here in the US, there's actually vast amounts of land. And if you look at what this land is utilized for, we're using 100 million acres to grow soybean and corn for, 50% of that is for livestock feed. That is just a waste. Like, why would we feed any amount of corn and soy to animals like cows that they can just survive off grass? And then if we become more creative with pork and chicken as well, then we don't need to use that much amount of land. And of course, we don't need to use that much amount of land to grow corn and soy and wheat for these highly processed foods. And then we also have, hundreds of millions of acres of public land that's barely being utilized. I drive out in Wyoming. You've never been in this area before. Sometimes there's these vast amounts of land that are public land, and you see like 10, 20, 30 cattle on them. And that rancher has a lease with this public land, but he's not actively managing it. So he's really, because the soil quality and the forage there is quite low. So the carrying capacity is pretty low. So that's why they just throw like less than 100 cows on, it could be 20,000 acres, which if you had an active management system of rotating and adaptive grazing, then you could over time increase the carrying capacity and productiveness of that land. And then say in 10 years, you could put, 500 or 1,000 cattle on that land. But nobody's doing this. So there is quite a large amount of land here in the US. And that's part of, the equation with scaling this to feed more people. But it goes beyond calories, of course, right? It's about nutrient quality. And, if it is hyper local, it can be replicated.
Well, this is the whole thing that many people don't see about ruminant agriculture. They think, oh, you've got cows on a field. Why don't you get rid of the cows and then grow more crops, which makes more calories? So you actually flip it and you say, actually, cows and goats and sheep and other ruminant animals can make a very unproductive area nutritionally productive. You can put them on the side of mountains. You can put them, where you can't plow and do standardized agriculture, but you can then start extracting nutrition from that grass growing on a fairly steep hill. So look, people don't understand that you're actually optimizing our land by having ruminant agriculture. That's a very basic level of why ruminant agriculture is good. And then you layer in all the stuff, like you say, nutritional density, and like the fact that, anti-nutrients from some corns and grains. And you look at the advent of monocrop agriculture 10,000 years ago, and you see that once that was brought in, you start seeing all these diseases coming in, gout and diabetes and diseases that result from high carbohydrate diets. So like that, all of this is lost in the mist of climate change and the mist of someone needing a scapegoat for climate change.
Yeah, no, those are fantastic points, right? Like we can raise ruminants where you can't grow crops, or even if the soil is to such a degraded point, you could use ruminants to start that regeneration process, and then you could grow crops. Or you could have, regenerative area could have both, or it could have multi-species grazing. I mean, if you have, for example, chickens that run after cattle and they eat the larvae out of the mud pies, this is fantastic for like parasitic infections. And then you get both chickens and beef from the same amount of land, and that's utilizing the land to the utmost capacity. And that's like the mindset you need to have. But it's really, like I said, it's impossible to do these calculations because each piece of land will have a different capability. But yeah, of course. And that's where we get, the chronic diseases we have today. And it's really a shame. But climate change, I think it's just really, beef has become this huge scapegoat because it's like an easy way for people to conceptualize, hey, I could probably stop eating meat. That doesn't seem that hard. And they do it. And obviously all these numbers are so ridiculously overstated, and they don't take into account how beef could actually be a huge benefit for the environment by this regenerative system that sequesters carbon to a degree that's actually, makes an impact. But this is also part of a natural cycle of carbon being emitted in the form of methane that's been going on for thousands of years. I mean, here in North America was via 30, 50, 60 million bison that were on the Great Plains. And they are the ones that fertilize this soil. That's why we had such fertile soils here. But now we've replaced that with, 100 million European cattle, and it's a bit different. And yeah, the emissions maybe are slightly higher, but then that's maybe a 50 to 100% increase. Whereas the whole entire transportation industry and all this other stuff didn't even exist 150 years ago.
Healthcare industry,
Nothing.
the
Yes.
amount of keeping the lights on in hospitals. Like I've heard that the US healthcare system or sick care system, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
that's 10% of the US emissions.
Yeah, yeah. But does it really matter, from, if you're really an environmentalist and you care about the land, like you should be counting chemicals and pollutants over carbon, if you really care about it. But this whole narrative that is painted for us. And really, I think all of this ties back to a broken monetary system, right? Because if the money is broken and inflation's so high, all of these companies have to meet this insatiable desire to grow, because they have to sit in front of their shareholders and investors and figure out how are they continuing to make more money and more profit. And that's the only way this Ponzi scheme keeps on going. And in order to do that, I mean, yeah, regenerative agriculture, meat just in general, from like a natural perspective, is not, you can't just grow it like that. But if you put it in a feedlot and you slam a billion chickens in 10,000 acres that have nowhere to go, yeah, that's how you get $2 a pound for chicken. That would never exist if we didn't have this industrial food system. Then you want to look at why meat packers are some of the biggest investors in plant-based foods and lab-based meat. Why? Because when they have a factory of these processed ingredients and these fake meat where you can get machines to just make it, you could scale that to Mars. You could
Is that
feed
what they're
everybody.
investing in? They're investing
Yeah,
in these
yeah.
plant-based things.
Some of the largest
Who are the main ones, like
investors,
Tyson and
Tyson, JBS, Cargill, they're all investing because they're not stupid and they don't care about meat versus veganism. They care about making money, and that's what
because
it's all about.
that's what I never. The argument is always like, where's the voice of the meat industry pushing back and saying like, hey, meat is good for you, blah blah blah. Like, there are a few little small campaigns, but mostly all we hear is this wave of like anti-meat sentiment.
Yeah, because they don't really care. I mean, they have their hands in so many different pockets, and like I said, they are funding a lot of these plant-based startups. But as we see, a lot of these plant-based companies are tanking because
It's great to see.
It's the last glimpse of the free market that we have, and people are just like not buying this crap. But that's in their mind how it makes sense, is because when you can factory make something, you can infinitely scale it, and that's just how you make more money, because costs come down, and then you could build a factory anywhere. So that's really this whole problem I see, and why processed foods have come to such a degree. Because every industry, I mean, whether it's healthcare, whether it's tech, whether it's food, they all just have to continue to satisfy their investors and their shareholders to make more money. And local producers, they care about their customers. Big companies and big corporations, they care about their investors and making more money. So that's the difference.
That's the funny thing. I'd heard that, I don't know whether it's 60s or 70s, when the anti-smoking sentiment started to come in. Saw all the big tobacco companies like British American Tobacco, and I can't remember the other big ones. They were all started investing in the big confectionery businesses and the big like sugar companies. So they immediately, there was this like knowledge in the industry that, hey, sugar's just as addictive as smoking, or so let's segue into a similar market where we know we can make money, and then there's just the transfer of these same practices, pushing stuff on people, muddying the water with research, and funding science that you want to hear and pushing down science that you don't want to hear. And it's the same playbook.
It's the same playbook. Yeah. And it's infiltrating universities. So you want to talk about like why, the farming methodology, all the farming agriculture universities, they all teach like high input, high output, and that degrades the soil quality. And, from a nutritional perspective, you look at all the American Dietary Association, American Heart Association recommendation. I mean, they're literal jokes. And, the sugar industry funded the suppression of research, and to blame, saturated fats. This is known. There's so many things that are coming out now that, like in the 60s, 70s, all this kind of, this muddying of the research. And yeah, it's crazy. I mean, if you just look at like who's funding the research, which if you read any paper, it's right at the bottom of the paper, which nobody scrolls to. It's insane how many, you know, parties of interest. And then, you know, we always get that thrown back in our face. Oh, well, big meat and big dairy are funding stuff too. And I'm just like, no, like, I mean, not really. And like you said, that it's actually pretty quiet. But yeah, I mean, it's not about like meat versus plant. It's about big food versus small local producers. Like, you know, I don't support big dairy or Cargill or JBS or Tyson either. And that's what it's all about, is like, I don't hate vegans either. If they're vegans eating locally raised vegetables and fruits, they're doing fantastic. But there's also vegans who are just slamming Beyond Burgers and eating French fries all day, and then trying to tell people that that's healthy, but they're wondering why, you know, they feel like shit all the time. So that's the distinction we need to make as a, you know, a society, and realize, you know, everything. And then you could talk about obviously the whole COVID situation of just being duped by marketing and media influence into all of the hands of these big corporations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all the, like, oh God, there's so much stuff in that COVID bucket. Like, in terms of, like, just think about subsidies for anything. Like, subsidies is essentially taxpayers funding different industries for the hope that that's a benefit for the common good of the people. But like, the way that certainly the vaccine was funded through taxpayer money, and no stake was given in the business of, you know, Pfizer or AstraZeneca or all these big businesses, and then billions and billions being made off the back of that quote unquote research, the mRNA stuff. Like, and now they're putting up the price of this stuff, and they're still locked into government contracts for, like, I'm not going to go into the detail, like deep details of stuff, because this is going to go on YouTube, and, you know, then it's going to get sharply taken down.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, like, just on the premise of like taxpayers getting value for what they've funded, and getting, like, we have people in control of these governments that do not give a fuck about people, or they've got their hands tied behind their back in something, you know, they're being blackmailed, or, you know, the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing, where, you know, people are only being put into power when they know they've got something held over them, or they can be controlled.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, whether it's like they're getting lobbied and funded by the big corporation of choice, or, you know, they have their backs against the wall, they need to do something, or else the public's going to freak out, and, you know, they're trying to cover up whatever, you know, funded research lab mistakes happened, and just get out something as soon as possible. Who knows? But it doesn't matter, because it's a matter of fact that, you know, these big pharmaceutical companies have profited immensely off of this. And they, you know, we're one of two countries, and probably the only country, that allows for such an absurd amount of marketing from pharmaceutical companies to have, you know, in advertisements on television, everything like this.
I think Pfizer's marketing budget is something like 20% higher than their research and development budget.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there's so many examples of this. And then you look at like their history with, you know, paying fines and things like that. I mean, they've paid billions in fines for fraudulent marketing. I mean, you look at like the whole opioid epidemic with like Purdue Pharma and Johnson like funding, you know, unknowingly, having this very lax system to allow, you know, just so much opioids go out in the market, and they pay like $5-10 billion in fines. I mean, Bayer Monsanto for glyphosate and Roundup. Sorry about that.
They're coming for you.
Yeah. It's just, yeah, that's how it goes, right? And yeah, like you said before, they have these like potential $1 billion fines. You know, if they paid $10 billion in 5 years for unknowingly releasing a vaccine that, you know, causes harmful side effects and potential death, they still made 100 billion off of it. So that's okay. And, you know, you can just get muddied into the water with like, yeah, Johnson makes like, you know, cancer treating drugs, but then they have sunscreen with, you know, carcinogenic chemicals in them that they pull from the market after like research surfaces. So yeah, what's really going on? And I mean, the whole system is set up to just, you know, put a dollar on the individual's name. So if you prioritize, you know, taking care of yourself from a health perspective, then you're really hurting the economic system that's going on right now.
Yeah. That's the crazy thing. You know, I think it was either AstraZeneca. I think one of these. It was either AstraZeneca or Pfizer or there's one more, and they had a big scandal with the Vioxx scandal. I think it was it's like a heart medication, and they paid crazy. They knew the damages that were being done with this medication. It was actually making people's heart conditions worse. And so they paid this fine, which was massively below what they'd made in profit. And anyway, so they're now part of this Facebook misinformation campaign to decide what is and is not misinformation. They've put 20 million into this sort of independent fact checker group on Facebook to decide who is the arbiter of truth. And so we've got the fox in the hen house here. Like the fox is guarding the chickens, and loads of people I speak to about this, they're like, yeah, but you know, they've got best interest at heart. You know, they're why would they? And I'm like, hang on, just like you said, like look back at their track record. Like it's not like they've suddenly changed.
That's what was stunning to me, because I felt like pre 2020, like there was a lot of the left who was like slamming like if anything, the pharma was like on the right. And then this total 180 happened. I was like, wait, this is the same pharmaceutical companies that are like marking up insulin and other life-saving drugs, price gouging like no other. And then all of a sudden we're supposed to just trust them blindly on this. Like what happened? Like that's how well the fear mongering of the media worked. And of course, that's who's funding all of it. So yeah, I mean, but it also, I think from a beneficial perspective, woke up a lot of people's and mindset in terms of this stuff. And they were like, no, like I'm not just blindly trusting this. Or they realized, yeah, wow, like inflation, like everything is just a huge issue. So I think it accelerated and woke up a lot of people. It created for sure a bigger divide, but I think a lot of things could be taken as a positive out of this, because the problem with governments, right, is like they encroach one step at a time, right? They come a little closer, a little closer, a little closer in terms of like taking away your freedoms. And then with COVID, they took like, 10 feet forward, and some people were like, yeah, fuck no, like this is not happening. So that's a good thing. And now we need to figure out how do we keep that momentum going to push back and get back to the level of individual freedom and sovereignty.
Well, they went 10 feet forward and then maybe got pushed back 3 feet, but they still took 7 feet.
Exactly. So that's where we're at now. But I think a lot of people always, that they don't know what they can do or how to get involved. Bitcoin, like I said, I think it's important to do your own research. It's important to understand the fundamentals of Bitcoin and why I wrote about it in first chapter of the books, What is Bitcoin? And it's important from a food and just perspective, health, like take control of your health. That's why I wrote about all this. Originally I had such poor health because I had one too many brain injuries, many concussions. I was like suffering for like over a year of
you're
like
playing
daily
football
symptoms.
or you're playing
Football. Yeah, no, you're football. Yeah, soccer.
You're playing soccer from soccer. You got loads of concussions.
Yeah, center defender. I mean, most
wow.
of them were from that, but then I had one that was not. The last one just lost consciousness and hit my head. But probably a lot of cumulative, wear and tear from years of football. And so I felt robbed. I was a very high functioning person. I was an engineering student and playing college football. And then all of a sudden I couldn't even exercise at all. I was sleeping 12 hours a night. I was super depressed. And then I just felt robbed of, my health and the ability to do anything that I wanted. So I took, a stance and went down the self-healing rabbit hole. And that's why I became so passionate about this. But then I realized, it's really all these topics are about taking control of your life, like wanting to be in the driver's seat. Your health, your wealth are the two most important things. Unfortunately, you need money to, do a lot of things in life. And you can't do any of them if your health is suffering. So they go hand in hand. And I realized that for the longest time, we've just been robbed of the individual sovereignty and quality from these large corporations. And so many of us have been psyoped into trading convenience for quality. But now we have the ability to kind of take back control. But what happens when you do that is, I mean, you need to have the individual responsibility in order to do that. You need to prioritize, taking care of your body, eating the highly nutritious foods. It takes effort to go to your local farmers market, connect with your farmer, verify the quality of their operation, and then if they deserve so, provide them value with your money, or even Bitcoin, exchanging value for value and keeping that locally in your economy. And then, prioritizing your health and keeping a fit body and moving outdoors. It all comes down to the same bucket, but you have to take a mental step in the right direction and understand that that matters, and you're willing to do that.
Yeah, 100%. Well, it's going to get to that point where people suddenly turn around and they go, hang on, I'm not allowed outside anymore. Hang on, I'm not allowed to go here on a Tuesday because of the climate. And then, then we saw that in the pandemic. And that's when people start to wake up and go, hang on, these people have got a lot of control over my life. How do I get that back? So like supporting those local communities and supporting local farmers means that power is being taken away from those concentrated areas. Only one person at a time. That's all it takes. Like one person at a time, just taking that responsibility. And it might be that only you get at the start, you only say, right, 2 days a week, the food that I eat is going to be from a farmer's market. It might not be every day, but I'm going to make that step, or 1 day a week, or one meal a week, or just I'm going to go out and explore these things. It doesn't have to be all at once, but it needs, like, that's the only way to do it, is one small step at a time and finding what you love about it and engaging with that food. I think the message is epic, mate.
Yeah, it's getting connected, right? Like we're so disconnected from where our food comes from, how our monetary system works. If we plug back in, you will open your mind to, the wonders, and then you'll feel more, you'll just feel more grateful, and you'll eat this chicken. I got a regenerative pasture-raised chicken from my friend last month, and I even traded him, part of the payment for a copy of my book, and I was eating it. I was just like, wow, this is so great. And, if you know where your meat or your produce or your fruit comes from, you can have that much more enjoyment. And say you have a product of your own and you traded for that. And but yeah, it's obviously, you don't need to go like a full 180, and really just see where you can make positive impacts of your life, because there is a lot of momentum in this space, but we need a lot more. And although you may think that the biggest influence you can make at a political level is by going to the ballot box every November, it's not. It's every day you have a consumer dollar or whatever currency in that you can purchase food with, and where you spend your money is the biggest power you have as an individual.
I love that. Tristan, it's been epic to speak today. If anyone wants to find a copy of your book or reach out to you, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, my book, Bitcoin and Beef, is on Amazon. So you can find it there. Definitely check it out. If you're a Bitcoiner listening to this, I don't know how many are. It's also available on the Oshi app if you want to buy it in Bitcoin. I'm most active these days on Twitter. So my handle is at Bitcoin_beef. Write a lot of educational threads and connect with the local communities, both health focused and Bitcoin focused. But I'm also on Instagram, Tristan_health, and Bitcoin and Beef. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, man. This was a great discussion, and yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, mate. Speak soon.